Thank you for joining us for the 10th ICG 2020's Development Dialogue. We have with us Dr. K. Subramanian, the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. He'll be in discussion with Mr. Dattaraj Salgaocar, Vice President of the International Centre Goa, on India's economy in post-COVID times, opportunities and fault lines. Before we begin, I would like to hand over the stage to Mr. Yatin Kakodkar, President of the International Centre Goa, for his introductory remarks. Thank you. Mr.
Good evening. A warm welcome to the International Centre Goa and to the 10th webinar program on the series 2020's Development Dialogue. The topic today is India's economy in post-COVID times, opportunities and fault lines. The COVID-19 pandemic has devastated millions of people all over the world. India too has suffered enormously. The Indian economy has been buffeted by lockdowns, closure of businesses and disruption of the global economy. However, our economy has shown signs of a robust V-shaped recovery in the first quarter of 2021-22, underpinned by economic reforms, prudent fiscal spending, and strong fundamentals of the Indian economy. The economic data of the first quarter is encouraging. What exactly are the opportunities and threats for the Indian economy in the foreseeable future? To shed light on this, we are privileged to have with us Dr. K.V. Subramaniam, Chief Economic Advisor to Government of India. Dr. Subramaniam is a leading expert on economic policy, banking and corporate governance. A PhD from Chicago Booth and a top-ranking IIT, IIM alumnus, he authored the path-breaking economic survey that commends ethical wealth creation for a prosperous India. By integrating India's rich economic and spiritual heritage with modern economic ideas, he advocates ethical wealth creation through the marriage of the invisible hand of the market with the hand of trust. The 2019 economic survey, again authored by Dr. Subramaniam, laid out the strategic blueprint for India to become a $5 trillion economy by generating a virtuous cycle where private investment growth and consumption feed into each other. In the 2021 economic survey, he advocated counter-cyclical fiscal policy using public capital expenditure to trigger the virtuous cycle following the COVID crisis. Drawing on the ideas advocated in his 3 economic surveys, India's economic policy towards a self-reliant India is now characterized by 1. Sharp focus on economic growth to complement efficient welfare by generating the resources to fund the welfare programs. 2. Growth via private sector occupying the commanding heights of the economy. And 3. Virtuous cycle of growth via public investment and structural reforms to enhance both aggregate supply and aggregate demand. The slew of reforms implemented by the government draw on the ideas advocated by Dr. Subramaniam. He has brought several ideas to implement the welfare programs effectively. His push for the behavioral economics of nudge is acknowledged for its potential to bring behavioral change in India. His idea of thalinomics, what a common person pays for a vegetarian or a non-vegetarian thali, has been acclaimed as the Indian Big Mac Index, combined with the idea of the Bare Necessities Index to measure the reach of water, sanitation, a healthy environment to the common citizen. These ideas enable robust measurement of the reach of welfare programs across India's large population. Dr. Subramaniam is on leave from the Indian School of Business, where he is a professor of finance. Dr. Subramaniam has been conferred the Distinguished Alumnus Award by his alma mater, IIT Kanpur. Apart from being the youngest Chief Economic Advisor, Dr. Subramaniam is among the youngest to receive this honor from his alma mater. His research in banking, law and finance, innovation and economic growth, and corporate governance has been published in the world's leading journals. In conversation with Dr. Subramaniam is Mr. Dattaraj Salgaocar. Mr. Salgaocar is the chairman of the Goa-based VM Salgaocar Corporation, Private Limited, with a presence in hospitality, real estate, and private equity. He is passionate about education and the arts, and his foundation runs schools and colleges in Goa. He founded the Sunaprang Goa Center for the Arts in 2007, which has transformed the Goan cultural landscape. He is a production engineer from Vijay T I Bombay University and an MBA from Wharton Business School. Mr. Salgaocar is a founder member of ICG, Vice President of ICG, and chairs the ICG Programs Committee. I now hand over the session to Mr. Salgaocar, and I hope you find it interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Yatin, for your welcome. And I would like to warmly welcome Dr. Subramanyam. It's a great honor, sir, for us to have you with us at ICG, one of the youngest and most handsome chief economic advisor we have in the country. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And being with us. So let me dive straight in, Dr. Subramanyam. Tell us something about your early childhood, your early life. You were born in Chhattisgarh, you went to school in Bhilai, and then onwards to IIT Kanpur. Who were the people who impacted and influenced you? Was it your family, your peers, or your friends?
Thank you very much, Mr. Kakodkar, Mr. Salgaocar, and all the organizers for inviting me. It's a privilege to be here to share my thoughts. I come from a very humble background. I am the first person in my family, both sides, both my mother's and father's side, to have stepped into the portals of a university. So one of the biggest contributors to where I am today, is my dad and my mom. My dad passed away in 2015, but I can still feel his presence. He lost his father when he was just 7 years old, and so he could only complete school education, and that too through the largesse of his elder brother and an elder sister. But the two of us, me and my younger brother, we're just two siblings. Both of us, he was very insistent on us getting the education that he never got. In fact, I remember the first time when he came to IIT Kanpur, and I took him to the library. There, he sat in that library for so long, and just enjoyed the environment. He was a voracious reader. So I still remember his remarks saying, "You're so lucky to actually, be able to be in the library." He asked me, "How much time do you spend in the library?" I was ashamed to, tell him I don't spend that much time. But, he sort of, when you are in undergraduate, your priorities oftentimes are not what your dad's priorities are at that time. So, seeing him, I actually did feel a little ashamed as well that, he values being in the library so much, so maybe I should spend a little bit more time. So I think that's sort of reflective of the kind of, background that I came from. My parents were, I think quite, I would say very visionary in, sending us to a English medium, a convent. None of my, my cousins are actually were put there. So my father joined as a, after finishing his school, he joined the Indian Railways in the clerical grade, and then grew just based on his hard work. He retired as a gazetted officer only based on his, hard work. So what my dad inherited to me is, I think, primarily three things. One, an emphasis on hard work, just, as it is not just with our family, with most middle class families, the value of emphasizing of hard work, and right values, especially no shortcuts, do things the right way. And I think at the same time also an appreciation for Indian culture. My father, as I've seen him from a very young age, used to always carry a pocket Bhagavad Gita. And when I was in CBSE, in class 6, they start teaching you Sanskrit. So I must have learned a few bits of Sanskrit, phalam, phale, phalani, that kind of, the conjugation that they teach you. He asked me to read the Bhagavad Gita then. And I think, while I was not able to read much, but the fascination with Bhagavad Gita and more generally, our own literature, I think he sowed the seeds for that. And that is, I'm really grateful for, because I think, while economics is a very rich discipline, no question, but, there is a lot to learn beyond economics as well. And I think I have been fortunate enough to, because of my backgrounding, to appreciate the finer nuances of who we are as a society, the kind of civilization that we were, and thereby also, combine the best of what the West has taught me, what the best educational institutions in this country and the world have taught me, together with what I've been able to learn, from my parents so that's sort of the spirit of, unlike most people who have, who have sat in this office, who were born with a silver spoon or with much more, with much more enriched backgrounds. I take enormous pride in the fact that, I come from the kind of background that I do come from, and just remain enormously grateful to my dad for having put the right values. And I think, one of the things I learned from him, he used to say, is that if your only ambition in life is to become rich, it shows an extreme poverty of ambition. I think that is, that's a thought that has struck with me, a lot. And I think, yeah, so otherwise a very, similar normal background, but just from Chhattisgarh. And I think the other thing that helped me is that because I was born, I mean, somebody who's a Tamilian, growing up in the north. So when I look at myself, I think I've been exposed to the best of India, both from the South Indian culture and the North Indian culture. For instance, I listen to MS Subbulakshmi with as much enjoyment as I listen to Anup Jalota or Hari Om Sharan. And I think that mixing of actually both the Indian and the both the North and South Indian, I think, has made me made me who I am. I mean, similarly, both Bollywood and Tamil movies. So in that sense, I think just a very eclectic mix, I guess, of of a lot that is good about India.
Fascinating. I think, thank you for sharing this with us. I think you're really blessed to have such beautiful parents inculcating such values. You went to do your PhD at the Booth School of Business, University of Chicago, one of the most prestigious universities in the world. But the main tenets of the Chicago School of Business are free markets, and they believe that they are the best way to allocate resources in an economy, and minimal, even no government intervention is better for economic prosperity. And of course, they have rejected gains in favor of monetarism. How much have these tenets influenced you, Dr. Subramanyam, in your own economic thoughts?
It's a very good question. So before I talk about that, I actually want to recall this, very, very influential conversation. I mean, it wasn't really a conversation, but advice that that I had the first time when I went to, joined there. I went to meet Dr. Rajan, and he said something which still rings in my, ears. And he said, one of the best things of studying at a place like the University of Chicago is that you see greatness in flesh and blood. When you see greatness in flesh and blood, you can start believing that you can be like them as well. And that is the first, but possibly the most important step. And I think those words are ones that I actually try to convey, forward as well. As it is with a lot of mentoring or, with parents as well, you can never repay your debt to them. You can only pay it forward, to your kids and to those whom you get to mentor. So I think that's something I just want to mention. I think been incredibly fortunate to have been mentored by people like him and studying at the University of Chicago. So now to your specific question, while I certainly was influenced a lot by the University of Chicago's, the stream of thought of markets, but at the same time, I was also influenced a lot by other streams of thought that were, there at the University of Chicago around that time. For instance, the book that Raghu and and my other advisor Luigi Zingales wrote, Saving Capitalism from Capitalists. That is a body of work that does not take the view that markets are perfect. It in fact takes the view that if you do not fix some of the market failures, then you may, laissez-faire is not necessarily the best outcome. There are areas where there are market failures. Similarly, around the time when I was there, both we had the efficient markets camp, which is headed by Gene Farmer, and the behavioral economics, Richard Thaler, and in the seminar, the Tuesday finance seminar that used to happen, interestingly, both of them used to sit on opposite sides, both ideologically and physically. And I was exposed to that line of thinking as well. So I would say that I think I was able to be at the University of Chicago at a time of enormous intellectual churn, in the economics profession. And just as I graduated and started doing my research, took my initial steps in research, the global financial crisis happened. And that illustrated, some of the most glaring failures of markets. And I think, therefore, I have come to the view that markets work 95, 96% of the times. And I think, but they don't work 100% of the times. There are, there are sectors, there are times when, intervention is very important. And that is why if you go and, for instance, read my, the economic surveys over the last 3 years, on the one hand, I've actually advocated markets, but on the other hand, I've also advocated state intervention. So if I were to capture the nuanced view that I have gathered, and I will contrast this with, what India is doing now vis-a-vis what India has done. Government should actually be in the job of providing public goods which markets always underprovide. Whether this is in education, healthcare, policing, those are the areas. But government should not be in areas where private sector can actually take care, where market failures are not there as much. If you look at the post-independence, the policy that and what government did, the Indian government did exactly the opposite, which is it did not invest in areas that it should, which is public goods, with your infrastructure, healthcare, education, right from the first industrial policy to the entire socialist era up until 1991, even up until recent times, the government ended up doing, actually, I wouldn't say ended up doing, I think that maybe was basically faulty policy, faulty thinking, that it invested in doing things that it should not have been doing, and did things that it did not do things that it should be doing, and did things that it should not be doing, which is basically the entire public sector, and running an airline, running a hotel, which actually should be the responsibility of the private sector. So the nuanced view that I have gathered is that you need the private sector, and that is why if you see the Honorable Prime Minister's speech in the budget session of Parliament, this year, he talked about wealth creation, he talked about private sector, he talked about efficiencies in the private sector. And I think if you look at the entire Atmanirbhar Bharat idea as well, it is one of the most crucial edifices of Atmanirbhar Bharat is empowering the private sector. So in some sense, if you look at in terms of the industrial policy, we've come full circle from the first industrial policy that gave primacy gave the commanding heights of the economy to the public sector, and thereby basically did exactly the wrong thing, which is doing what it should not be doing and not doing what it should be doing. Now we've come full circle where the government invests actually in infrastructure, healthcare, education, and lets the private sector do things that it is actually best at. I think so to summarize, this is the nuanced view that I've come up with. I think markets are very important. I think, given our socialistic past, we still have to unwind a lot of things that the government should not be doing in India, and taking those resources and putting it into things that the government should be doing.
Thank you so much. This has really explained a lot of things of the government, and what they're doing certain things economically. Coming to our gross domestic product, it showed a record high of 21.1% in the first quarter ended June 30th of this year, and a rebound in consumer spending. Help paint us a picture of where we are today, and how would you evaluate India today in terms of macroeconomic fundamentals like current account deficit, foreign exchange reserves, inflation, and other metrics?
So there are two parts in which I would like to answer this question. First, I think there is no question that not only India but the entire world has been impacted by the pandemic. Unlike previous crises where restrictions did not have to be put on economic activity, in the COVID crisis, the health response has necessitated putting restrictions on economic activity. And the world over, therefore, these restrictions on economic activity have had their impact. I think, if you look at what, the entire GDP growth after the first quarter decline last year of 24.4%, India has had a V-shaped recovery, 7.5% for Q2, 7.5% decline for Q2, which was certainly better than the first quarter when we had that very strong lockdown. Q3 at 0.4% growth and 1.6% growth in Q4, and now albeit from the low base, a growth of 20.1%. So there is clearly a V-shaped recovery. If you plot these growth rates on a chart, what you see is a V. I think a nuance that is very important to keep in mind, that the growth in consumption has been from the low base, but it is despite the fact that in the months of May and June, because of the devastating second wave, there were a lot of restrictions that were put. For instance, to give you some data, one of the high frequency indicators that we track is the Google mobility indicators. So, if you look at retail activity, right from the 1st of April, it was down all up until 15th of July. The entire Q1, it was down. And at its peak, it was down 70% from the March 31st levels. So supply side of consumption, in other words, if you wanted to go and buy a shirt, you couldn't go to a mall because the malls were closed. If you wanted to go to shops, actually shops were only open only for a few hours. So I think the supply side of consumption itself was impacted. Despite that, the fact that consumption grew by 20%, albeit from a low base, I think is something very important. Said differently, what I would say is Q1 of last year and Q1 of this year, both were impacted by the pandemic. Q1 of last year was the first wave, and Q1 of this year was the second wave. So in some sense, an apples to apples comparison, where we had the large decline in Q1 of last year because of the national lockdown, and this time because the restrictions were there at the state level, a good recovery that is happening. Now let me come to the second part of the question. I think this part is very important in order for us to understand where we are in terms of the the impact of the pandemic and the recovery itself. In terms of the macro fundamentals, we are in a very good shape. So the three key metrics, and you talked about that as well, which matter for macroeconomy, are your fiscal deficit, inflation, and current account deficit. Now, I would actually, I wrote a piece a few months back, I think in March, in the Economic Times, looking at the past three crises that India has had: the Asian financial crisis, global financial crisis, and the current crisis. And the difference in the policy responses. If we just use simple economics, Econ 101, supply and demand, what we know is if you only increase demand, you get an increase in quantity, but you also get an increase in price when you just increase demand. But if you increase demand and increase supply, you have a much greater increase in quantity, and price does not change. Price remains almost the same. I think this important facet has been reflected in India's COVID policy now, because we've done a lot of supply side measures. We've also done on the demand side, but a lot more on the capital expenditure side than on the revenue expenditure side. making sure that the the revenue expenditures are well directed. And because oftentimes what happens is that in India, revenue expenditures can actually not go into the hands that are really the most distressed, and so doing it carefully is important. So if you look at these, because of the supply side response, inflation has averaged about 6.1% last year. Now it has started coming down. You saw the print, last 2 months, 5.7%, and now 5.3%. This I would contrast with the period during the global financial crisis, where despite there being no lockdowns, no night curfews, nothing, which creates supply side frictions, because your trucks cannot ply, stuff cannot move around when they have to actually be halted in the night. So there being no lockdown, no supply side frictions, yet you had 14% at inflation at the peak during the global financial crisis because of the absence of supply side measures, which is just the simple supply demand aspect that I mentioned. Similarly, if you look at the current account deficit, if you look at the policy that was done during the global financial crisis, the measures were primarily on the revenue expenditure, and two of those, the most sort of poster child kind of policies was on the revenue expenditure side, was the pay commission recommendations, implementing that, which basically income that went to the privileged sections, government employees, and the 85,000 crores farm loan waiver, which benefits of which was cornered primarily by the large farmers. I have a paper showing this in the Journal of Law and Economics as well. What this did was it put money in the hands of the privileged. Because domestic supply did not expand, so imports grew significantly, and therefore trade deficit really widened, and current account deficit also then went to about 5%. And because the expenditure was all revenue side, fiscal deficit became 6.7%, when the emerging economies average was 2.5%. So fiscal deficit of India was 2.5 times the emerging economies average. If you look at now, on the other hand, fiscal deficit, our fiscal deficit last year was 9.1%. The emerging economies average is 10.25%. So we're about 85% of the fiscal average. So all these three parameters, inflation, current account, which we've had a current account surplus because of the supply side, 0.9% current account surplus last year. And this year also, I anticipate the current account deficit. It'll be a deficit, won't be a surplus, with less than 2% though. So I think our current account is very good. If you also look at it in terms of two other metrics which are very important, which is currency depreciation. Around the global financial crisis, the currency depreciated by around 60%. In contrast, now it has held steady. And I think that is reflective of the of the fundamentals. If you look at FDI and FDI, there was outflow of about $9 billion around the global financial crisis. Now it is about inflow, significant inflow. FDI as well, I think 10 times more compared to then, about 8 billion then FDI inflow, about 80 billion now. So I think these are indicative of the fundamentals actually being very strong. I must mention, and this will be the last part of my response, today, there's a nice piece by Sajid Chinoy on the the tapering by the Fed. When it does come, there may be some short-term, impact, but I think long run, because the fundamentals are quite strong, we will be able to withstand the impact of the Fed tapering, much better around this time, because the different policy response focus a lot more on the supply side, capital expenditure, and much more careful demand side measures.
Thank you. You have also said in an interview, Dr. Subramaniam, that not cash but jobs will increase demand, and that job creation is a demand size measure, and not clear whether putting cash in the hands of people will increase demand. Could you elaborate on this approach?
I think I partly answered that in response to your previous question. So let me clarify a couple of things first. If you look at the transfers that have been made, in-kind transfers, almost 800 million, so that's 80 crore people have been given free food as part of the Garib Kalyan Yojana. There has been, free, LPG cylinders were also given. Apart from that, widows and some of the, the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana accounts have been given 500 rupees cash transfer. So when you add the in-kind plus the cash transfers, these have been directed primarily to people who are the most vulnerable, who is basically the people, the poor people. For instance, the PMJDY accounts, if you consider those are basically all at the bottom of the pyramid. These are no-frills accounts, and transfers, all cash transfers have been made to them. Now, when you come to basically cash transfers otherwise, and I'll give you a contrast. The United States, for instance, now their fiscal deficit is in the high double digits, and I'll give you an example. There's this friend of my daughter. My daughter is studying at the University of Chicago. Friend of my daughter who's a US citizen and therefore is eligible for transfers. She got a $5,000 check from the from Uncle Sam as part of the of the cash transfers. Now, I think to me that is illustrative of somebody who's studying at the University of Chicago, a private university, which basically charges a good amount of tuition. So anybody who's going to the University of Chicago certainly cannot be somebody who's really underprivileged or destitute, but gets $5,000. To me, I think that is indicative of basically the fiscal transfers not being well directed, or cash transfers not being well directed. Also, the other piece which is important is that unlike India, which where we have a PDS system, the United States or Europe, for instance, doesn't have a PDS system. So when they have to even provide for food, for the vulnerable sections, they have to do it only through cash transfers. We've done it through in-kind transfers because of the presence of the PDS system. So I think these important differences we have to take into account when we evaluate cash transfers that have been given by India versus other countries. Now, with that, let me now talk about the so I think we have to distinguish between essentials and luxury, when we talk about cash transfers. I think in a crisis, it is really important. It is actually, I think, critical that essentials are supported. And I think that is something that we've done not only through this, but also through the Manrega program, MNREGA, which actually provides for distressed employment. The allocations in that increased significantly. If you see last year, there was huge increase in the, and incidentally, if you see, even in the second wave, it had gone up till the month of May and has since come down significantly. So, the Manrega employment is also, tracking the extent of rural distress. And so that is also something that's been provided as a cushion. Now, when you come to actually, luxury items, I think this is where Keynes's insight was very important. That typically in a crisis, even if you give cash to the people, because of the risk aversion, people will not spend at that time. I think this was also being seen as, if you see the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana balances that increased by about 500 rupees. Now remember, 500 rupees for this section, about 400 million, accounts, is actually a very large number. So deposits went up by about 20,000 crores because of this, the increase. So that tells you that the, precautionary motive to save is a very strong driver during the, during crises, which is what Keynes talked about. But the demand increase that comes from actually jobs is far better. There is a, Milton Friedman is credited with this, what is called the permanent income hypothesis. The permanent income hypothesis basically says that a household's consumption increases only when there is a change in their permanent income. If there is a change in their temporary income, that does not increase their consumption. Why? Because households basically say, if for instance, I know that I'm going to get a cash transfer for maybe the next 6 months, 8 months or 12 months. But after that, those cash transfers are going to be withdrawn. I will not go and basically increase my consumption because I know very well I have to, trace back my consumption back to where I am today, after a month. So, that basically goes into savings. I think this is why the jobs are very important, because what jobs do is increase permanent income. When a person has a job in the organized sector, it increases not only does it increase the level of earnings compared to an informal sector job, At the same time, the volatility in earnings actually, which is also something which is very important, goes down, because when you have an organized sector job, you're assured of an income at the end of the month, and that really enables consumption. So I think from the perspective of demand creation, therefore jobs in the organized sector are very important. And I'll end with this final example. If you look at the United States and Europe, after the world wars, the President Roosevelt's New Deal was basically one that really created large amount of middle class by creating jobs in the organized sector. If you take, states like Michigan and cities like Detroit, for instance, these entire cities developed as middle class, from organized sector jobs that were created by the automobile sector there. So I think, therefore, the kind of demand push, aggregate demand push that happened in the United States from organized sector job creation is something that India, India needs, and that is why the manufacturing sector push that we are doing is very important.
Yeah. Thank you. Under PM Modi, there is a clear push to make India a manufacturing powerhouse. But on one hand, India represents a very attractive option for companies trying to reduce concentration risk to China in the global supply chain. But on the other hand, both forces of deglobalization are gaining ground, especially in the West, and companies are encouraged to, have their production back at home. Where do you see India coming out in this debate? Are we too late for the party?
It's a good question. If you look at India's share in the global trade pie, we are still at very, very, low single digits. So, if you sort of take the law of diminishing returns, and the level at which we are, we still have, we can still grow for a while in terms of, our participation in global trade without really, getting impacted by the forces of deglobalization. I think that those forces are very much there. But when you are, let's say, at about, if you're accounting for 25% of, let's say, world's exports, or even 15-20% of world's exports, then this is a phenomenon that really impacts you. But if you are actually at low single digits, and I think there is still a significant amount of potential to grow. So I think at the levels at which we are, I don't think this is as much a concern. So in this trade-off that you're, on the one hand, supply chains wanting to move versus the deglobalization, my sense is that the deglobalization phenomenon does not impact India as much, especially given the policy push on the manufacturing side. If you take the labor reforms, if you take the enterprise policy focused on the private sector, the ease of doing business improvements that have happened, and the PLI scheme, export PLI scheme, all of these are really important. And I will also add the budget, this budget's push on capex, capital expenditure in two sectors primarily, which is power and logistics. Because both of these are really important, inputs into production in the manufacturing sector, logistics costs and power costs. And, you can't compete in the global markets unless these costs are reduced. So together, if you take these into account, labor reforms, the ease of doing business and the push on logistics and on power, I think these are important in enabling our manufacturing sector to reduce their cost of production and thereby enable them to become competitive. When you add the incentives that is being provided through the export PLI scheme, I think we've sort of created a reasonable mix for our firms to actually benefit from the diversification of supply chains.
Thank you. Just to talk a bit different on a different topic about demonetization. You had supported the demonetization, in 2016. 5 years later, with the perspective of time, what do you think are the consequences, both positive and negative, that you have seen on the Indian economy with demonetization?
So, when demonetization happened, I had supported it. And, with some nuances, I still think actually it was, an excellent move. If you look at the digitization of the Indian economy, it started with demonetization. The creation of the, a lot of the digital infrastructure, in the financial sector, UPI, and overall our digital transactions itself have grown so much. I think that is something that happened because of demonetization. I'll give you an example. Where I stay in Delhi, near Chanakyapuri, there is this shopping place called Sarojini Nagar. Sometimes I end up going there. Even the person who's basically selling on the street, now takes Paytm. You can pay him by Paytm. I don't think that before demonetization ever you could actually walk in and pay a street vendor through Paytm or Google Pay. I think that is something which is actually, that's the kind of transformation that has happened. I know a lot of commentators talk about the growth decline before the pandemic, and they attribute it to demonetization and GST implementation. Let me be very clear here. There's a paper that is written by the current chief economist of the IMF, Geeta Gopinath, and her co-authors, published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. And there they state very clearly, they look at first, GDP growth at the macroeconomic level, and they do not find any impact of that demonetization period on growth. And that is why they actually try to look at sectoral patterns in that paper. They stated very, very clearly. So I think this commentary about demonetization and GST having impact on growth pre-pandemic is actually not supported by the evidence. As I had mentioned in last week's Times of India article, and last week, Professor T.T. Rammohan also wrote a piece in the Business Standard where he actually referred to this piece. The entire slowdown before the pandemic was due to the financial sector problems. And I've spoken about this in detail elsewhere. The Economic Survey of 2019-20, Volume 2 had a complete section, providing careful evidence on this. And in the Times of India piece also, I've actually spoken about this. But I think bottom line, it was the financial sector problems, which led to the slowdown. Because across the world, when you mess with the financial sector, the overhang that it creates is really very, very long. Unlike, for instance, the real sector. And I think if you just take the example of the global financial crisis versus the COVID crisis, global economy's performance, I think, is indicative of that. Last year, global economy shrunk by about 4% plus. This year is going to grow, at 4% plus. Just 1 year, the global economy is back, and actually global demand is looking very good. In contrast, remember the overhang that was created by the global financial crisis. After the US suffered, then you had actually several countries in Europe suffering sovereign defaults, and the overhang lasted for a long time. And research also supports this, that when you mess with the financial sector, the overhang is very, very long. And this was a lot of the crony lending that happened pre-2014, had its impact on, banking sector, then on the non-banking sector. And that is what led to the growth slowdown before. So bottom line, I actually think that demonetization was a very brave move. And let me also mention that whether it is corporate innovation or policy innovation, you have to take risks, because you do not get path-breaking outcomes without taking risks. If you want to do just marginal moves only give you marginal benefits. But if you want path-breaking benefits, you have to take risk. And I think demonetization, and I think there should be, and there can be, a debate about some of the implementation aspects. But when it comes to actually the intention behind the move, I think it was something that was really, really very beneficial in creating the entire, digital infrastructure. If you look at the entire, digital infrastructure itself, financial infrastructure, the account aggregator, the e-rupee now, the UPI, and the entire JAM trinity that has been created. You contrast it with a country like the United States. In India, we've created public infrastructure for digital assets. And I think this will really help in growing lending and overall, in economic growth itself. So I think this is something that was, indeed a very, very visionary move in my opinion. And I think India is now, really, reaping the benefits from the digital economy that has been created.
Thank you, Dr. Subramanyam. Taking from this, as you know, the future of the world is well accepted to be the knowledge and information and digital age. How will India become a knowledge powerhouse? I mean, now that we have a digitally transformed economy, the question is important because it is now accepted that while India's knowledge sector continues to lag behind in terms of quality. For example, there are thousands of engineering graduates, but there's shortage of skilled engineers. So how do we become a knowledge powerhouse in India?
I think that's also an excellent question. I think innovation requires, and innovation and knowledge, ecosystems require a close, interaction between between the government and the private sector. This year's economic survey, we wrote a chapter, heralding India becoming one of the top 50 economies in terms of innovation on the Global Innovation Index. And there we highlighted one key aspect, which is basically something that the private sector has to focus on, which is, if you look at the split of the innovation rupee, one rupee that goes into R&D, in the advanced economies, top 10 economies, the split is typically 2/3, 1/3, 2/3 by the private sector, 1/3 by the government. In other words, 67 paise by the private sector, 33 paise by the government. In India, it is exactly the reverse. 33 paise by the private sector and 67 paise by the government. And I think this is something that is very important. Private sector has to actually recognize that, especially in this digital economy, if they have to remain competitive, they have to innovate. It is like, being on a treadmill, where in order to stay where you are, you have to keep running. And I think that is the way corporates must view innovation, Indian corporates. And I think there is a need for having that visionary thinking, for innovation, because the essential aspect of innovation is that, the probability of success is low with innovation, any kind of innovation. But once you succeed, you generate huge returns from that. That is the nature of innovation. I think in that process, I think the private sector also has to focus on, on the and generating a close relationship with universities as well. Because if you look at the countries like Germany, and even the United States, a lot of academic institutions actually do get projects from the industry, and that gives keeps them exposed to what is happening, the cutting edge, both sides, both innovation and university, and students therefore work on these and thereby get exposure to the cutting edge, and thereby they actually come out as ready engineers or ready doctors or ready economists actually. And I think that is something which is very important. So I would focus a lot on the last mile, which is I think the theory and the conceptual grounding that is provided in our universities is something that is necessary. But what makes them sufficient to be able to actually go and work in the real world is taking these concepts and applying it to the real world. And I think that exposure of working on actual live research projects, through industry academia collaboration, I think is very important. The same aspect of that also has to happen in our ITIs and some of the lower skill, where the people who come basically need to be trained and I think be ready to hit the ground running. So I think overall, what I find, and I say this as somebody who's basically worked in a university and seen the university systems and the way they collaborate with industry in other countries, I think this is an aspect that actually needs to be far more in India. And I think for that purpose, the industry also has to recognize that they have to develop, inculcate, and actually they have to sort of invest in the universities. The returns will not come immediately. It may take some time, maybe 3, 4, 5 years, but the returns will come. But I think that kind of visionary thinking is incredibly important from the industry if the knowledge ecosystem and the innovation ecosystem, has to develop, far more, in our country.
Thank you, Dr. Subramanyam. I think with the new NEP policy and with what you're saying, I think the future looks quite bright and for the industry and for all the students who are going to pass out from these universities. Recently, the government announced an asset monetization plan that is expected. Of course, you talked about the PSUs earlier, about to net 6 lakh crores over 4 years. There has been, of course, the opposition always finds faults with everything, but I'm just asking this question: why is this necessary, and what are the benefits to this particular asset monetization plan?
So see, I circle back to a discussion that we were having earlier about the focus on capital expenditure, capex-driven, fiscal policy. And I just want to spend, 30 seconds to a minute on explaining this, because, what capital expenditure does is it actually creates assets in the economy. Unlike revenue expenditure, which does not create assets, capital expenditure creates assets in the economy. And, we economists have this term called fiscal multiplier, which is basically just jargon for, if the government puts in 1 rupee into the economy, what is it that the economy generates? That is what a fiscal multiplier is. Fiscal multipliers for capital expenditures are far greater than that for revenue expenditure. So research by NIPFP shows that fiscal multipliers for capital expenditure are about 4.8. In other words, government puts in 1 rupee, the economy generates 4.8 rupees from capital expenditure. With revenue expenditure, the government puts in 1 rupee, typically economy adds only 92 to 98 paise. In other words, between 2 to 8 paisa is lost when it's revenue expenditure. So this is the importance of capital expenditure and thereby infrastructure itself. Now, the question that comes is, how do you fund this infrastructure? It's not going to happen through thin air. There are limits on how much, fiscal spending you can do. When you have idle assets in the economy, those assets that are not being used, if those assets are, provided to the private sector for them to use, not own, for them to just use, and in return, you actually get, fees from them, for that money can be used to actually, to help creation of infrastructure. So I think the important point to remember here is twofold. One, that the asset monetization is being done primarily to enable, infrastructure creation, and which is really important, for the economy. Second, what the asset monetization does is it puts assets that are not being used, it brings them into use. Let me give you a tangible example. Let's say there's a sports stadium. That sports stadium, let's say, gets used only, let's say it's a cricket stadium that gets used only during IPL time, let's say. So, it gets used maybe for 2 months of the year, maybe Ranji Trophy games are played, etc. Overall, let's say it gets used about 90 days out of 365 days. So we are basically utilizing that particular asset in the economy only 25% of the time. Now, suppose that, that asset is leased to a private sector, to a company, for them to use remaining part of the, maybe they may not be able to use the entire 75% that is residual, but maybe they can use it 50% of the time, and so remaining 180 days. So what happens is an asset that is lying idle for 270 days, now it gets used 180 days. And in return for that, the private sector actually pays the government, and the government uses that money to go and create infrastructure. So I think, you can see the win-win that this creates. Idle assets are being put to use. And I want to actually, talk about this in the broader, this rhetoric of these 2 words that I used, family silver. And I think, it is rhetoric. It is not supported by evidence at all. And let me explain here. Neither the word family nor the word silver is appropriate in these cases. I'll tell you why. Because, if you take the word family, in the Indian economy, both public sector and private sector are siblings in this family. I think to say that only public sector is part of the family and private sector is, let's say an orphan child, I think that is not right, because especially when private sector contributes so much to our GDP. So the family has to include, public sector and private sector. So it's saying family silver for public sector assets, I think it has this connotation that only public sector is part of the family, private sector is not part of the family. Private sector should take legitimate, affront to this kind of characterization. Number one. Number two, let's look at the other word, silver. We've seen how, and we showed it in the economic survey as well, that the privatization actually creates efficiency gains and improves the lot of all stakeholders, including employees, suppliers, the shareholders, government also, in terms of the tax money that you get, and through that the citizens. So privatization has generated benefits, and we've shown through multiple examples, whether it is actually Maruti Suzuki or any of the others that you take. Privatization has indeed generated benefits. Why? Because there are efficiency gains that are achieved when you have the private sector using these assets. So I think neither the word family nor the word silver is correct, because in the government's hands, these assets have not been kept as silver for sure. Family assets, if they were indeed family assets, they should have been, and those that talk about it and call this family silver should have preserved it as silver. They have not done it. They're actually other metals, not silver, certainly. So neither the family nor the silver word is actually correct. It's just rhetoric. Evidence does not support this. So when you take the asset monetization program and the privatization program together, what you see is for the private sector to have both the option to own and also to lease assets. And every private sector firm does this both, either owns or leases. Both of them are options. And I think the asset monetization program is the way to lease assets, and the privatization is to actually own assets, both of which will bring efficiency gains for the economy.
Brilliant. We are coming right to the end. Can I ask you 3 more questions, Dr. Subramanian?
Sure.
Okay. What do you see as India's 5 most important challenges, in its path to development, and what would be the key drivers of India's economic growth in the coming years? And also a part of this question, when will we become a $5 trillion economy?
So, I'll give you a list of maybe 2 or 3 that I've thought about, maybe not 5. So the first one I would actually mention is the ease of enforcement of contracts. I think by far that is the most important. When you look at this, is basically the entire backlog of cases that we have in the judiciary. So judicial reform, that's the first and really important aspect that has to be focused on. Because if you look at the World Bank's ease of doing business rankings, out of 192 countries, we have been ranked in the 160s in the ease of enforcement of contracts. I think for a country that is now the 5th largest economy in the world, I think this is something that is just not befitting, that we are ranked so low in the ease of enforcement of contracts, because it actually creates so many spillovers. You can't write rich contracts, because you will think, what's the point of writing a rich contract? Because even if you have to go and litigate a simple contract, that also takes tariq pe tariq, tariq pe tariq, tariq pe tariq. So what's the point of writing a rich contract? And oftentimes in very innovative settings, actually, and this circles back to the earlier question that you asked me on innovation. Because of the tremendous uncertainty there is with respect to innovative projects, venture capitalists, angel investors, etc., in the rest of the world write very rich contracts to be able to take care of the many different contingencies that may arise from the enormous uncertainty. But that is not the case in India because of the difficulty in enforcement of contracts. So I think this is, for me, the number one. Similarly, there is also, if you look at the impact of some of these pronouncements as well. Consistency in the interpretation, I think is incredibly important. So I think that's something that I would put as number one. The second that I would actually say is what we already discussed, which is the knowledge ecosystem. I think that is something, the knowledge and the innovation ecosystem. I think this is something that the private sector must focus on really investing in innovation. I'll mention this example. I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to watch this wonderful movie on Srinivasan Ramanujan, the man who saw infinity. There is that episode, there is that interaction between him and Thomas Hardy. Now, just imagine if, let's say, someone instead of Thomas Hardy, had asked Srinivasan Ramanujan, who was working on number theory then, he's saying, "Ye number theory se dhanda kaise banega?" Support basically somebody had asked, "Ki paise kaise banenge? Number theory to tum kaam kar rahe ho, paise kaise banenge?" If somebody has asked that, right? Now, I don't think the world would have ever seen the advances in number theory, because the work that Srinivasan Ramanujan did then, that has been used today in algorithms, whether it's Google's algorithm or AI, machine learning. So many of these, actually use algorithms. And I think so this question that, paise dikhao, for innovation, I think that is something which actually shows, the absence of visionary thinking. Innovation is something that actually has to be long run vision thinking, has to be important. So whenever somebody says paise dikhao, I think this movie, Srinivasan Ramanujan's movie, and actually that anecdote, the world is indeed is actually indebted to Thomas Hardy that he didn't say paise dikhao, to basically for the work on number theory. So I think that is a lesson that needs to be imbibed in the so that's the second overall knowledge in ecosystem that I think. Third, we basically do need to on the direct tax side, I think in the indirect tax, GST has been implemented, and I think there's been now GST has stabilized well. That's been a good reform that has happened. There has been a lot of for instance, the faceless assessment, those things have been brought in, the citizens charter as well, for which was part of the budget announcement. I think those moves have been done, but I think the 1961, the code that we have is from 1961. Income tax that we have act is from 1961. There's been a lot of amendments to that, and I think simplifying that actually would be something that would be overall very important. And finally, I would say, and I think I'm coming very close to your 5, I'm giving you 4 there, is overall in state capacity itself. State capacity, I think India's state capacity in the way we formulate our regulation, and the way we implement that. This year's economic survey, we actually, talked about this, which is that, if you go back and sort of read some of the recent Nobel Prize winning work done by people like Oliver Hart, and others on incomplete contracts. The 2018 Nobel Prize, if I'm not mistaken, it's 2017 or 2018. The Nobel Prize was given for, in economics, was given for work on incomplete contracting, which recognizes that real world contracts can never ever take care of all the different contingencies that can arise in future. And when you think about regulation or you think about law, regulation and law are basically 1 to M contracts. Unlike a bilateral contract between 2 parties, regulation is actually a 1 to M contract, 1 regulator, M regulatees. Law is basically similarly, 1 legislature, M citizens. It's actually, these are finally contracts as well. And when you think from that prism, that the way there are contracts that are incomplete, therefore we have to recognize that you cannot have complete regulation, you cannot have complete legislation either. But in our overzealousness to actually make them complete, we, I think, introduce a lot of different contingencies, which makes it, oftentimes difficult for, those that want to do business in a straightforward way. makes it difficult for them. Those that want to circumvent basically will find ways still, and they end up finding ways. But I think this spirit of the way in which we frame regulation and the way we frame laws, I think is also also important. And let me complete the full list of five. The fifth one, which I would say is, there have been a lot of reforms that have been announced now. I think those need to be, they need to be, brought to fruition. And I especially would say the Farm Bill. And here, I want to talk about the political economy of reform, in India, especially in a democracy like ours, and what we really need. If you think about the political economy of reform, today's, there's a very nice article in Mint, again, in the, I think on the right page, top right, of the edit page. There's a very nice article talking about this political economy, and say, the author makes the point that a few people who have the voice, are basically stopping, reforms that will generate benefit for a large section of people. And I think, Farm Bill is a brilliant example of that political economy, where the benefits will come to large number of small farmers. In this country, while every other producer has the freedom to go and sell his or her produce wherever he or she wants, it's only the small and marginal farmer that has not been given this freedom to go and sell his or her produce wherever he or she wants. Our legislation has been such that we forced the small and marginal farmer to go and sell only to the intermediary, the Adathiya. Think about it, actually. Every other producer has the freedom. On the one hand, so many people, paint this rhetoric that we are basically pro-farmer. And, if you're pro-farmer, you have to be pro-small and marginal farmers. And yet you basically, in every word you say it's pro-farmer, but in every deed you keep basically, preserving that status quo of not giving that simple freedom to that producer of going and selling his produce where he or she wants. I think that is, that huge wedge between the word and the deed, I think conveys the emptiness of this rhetoric itself. So I think, citizens like us actually really need to separate the rhetoric from what is really the, what is the true intent here. And last point to elaborate this, I think, which is because it's so important. See, if I am actually a buyer or a seller, and I circle back to your second question about what did University of Chicago teach me. University of Chicago taught me the importance of markets, and what is one of the most important aspects of markets? It's competition. And when do you get competition? You get competition then when you have one or more, more than one buyer or seller. If suppose a buyer has to buy from only one, one seller, you get basically what is called, a monopoly. If you have, only one buyer, you get a monopsony, and both of those lead to abuse of power. That is what you have in the, farm economy now, where the small and marginal farmer loads his produce, maybe it is potatoes or onions, subah 7 baje uthe mehnat karke actually loads the truck, goes to the APMC mandi, wants to go and sell that. He comes there at, he reaches there at 8 o'clock. The intermediary Arhatya knows that this farmer has nobody else to go. Therefore, what does the Arhatya do? Arhatya makes him wait till 3 o'clock, 3:30. By which time, if he takes it back, he basically, he'll have to get it next day. Sar jayega, some part will get wasted. So, he will basically, rather than going and wasting it, he says, whatever you give me, I'll go and sell it. And this the Arhatya knows very well. In contrast, just think about the option that the farmer gets if you actually have, if he can go and sell it to someone else. You give him the simple freedom of going and selling his produce to someone else. The farmer waits for 2 hours. At 10 o'clock, the farmer sells the Arhatya. Saab, aapko lena hai to lo, nahi lena hai to main bagal wale APMC mein jaake bechta hu ya bagal wale jo shop hai wahan jaake bechta hu. As soon as that Arhatya knows this farmer has this option, he will not even try to make him wait. He'll basically buy it at 10 o'clock itself. That threat. This is what happens when I go to a Sarojini Nagar today, when I go to a fashion store, you go to a fashion street in Bombay, the fact that when I go to buy something, I can go to the next shop. That makes me, enables me bargaining, gives me bargaining power. This simple bargaining power, the small and marginal farmer has not had, because the basic freedom to go and sell his or her produce where he or she wants has not been denied. So there is a lot of rhetoric about pro-farmer, etc. But the reality is this. This is the deed which is departed from the word.
Thank you, Dr. Subramaniam. That was really very elaborate, I think. Thank you for giving all the 5 points, challenges to us. We asked this of all the speakers, so we'll ask this of you also. What is your vision for Goa? I mean, Goa is such a small state. What do you think are potential strong points of Goa, and how could we build the Goan economy stronger in the Indian context and globally?
Thank you very much. I think I've come to Goa a couple of times. It's a very good place. Fun people. I would say some of the things that we've spoken about, for India are as relevant for Goa as well. This last conversation that we had on the political economy, I think this is as important. When some of the taxi strike was happening, in Goa, I was actually reading about that. I think it is illustrative of some of the political economy where a few people, are able to sort of block reform that is really important for everyone. I think what we have to remember is that in a democracy, it's very hard to get consensus. Democracy means that if a move benefits more than 50% of the people, I think that is something that should get implemented. A small section that, let's say, accounts for 2% or 3% or even 10%, or for that matter, even 20-30%, should not be blocking or should not be able to block something that is good for more than 50% of the people. That is the essence of a democracy. And I think that is, I think overall the first, humble exhortation that I would actually make to people in Goa about having this, that is what actually gives our democracy the vibrancy, in being able to do what is good for a majority. Related to that, I think the investment, I would say, is very important. It's oftentimes, it's hard to actually build economic growth through investment, but it generates, sustained growth. I will give you this parallel. If you're sick, the doctor can give you steroids, or can ask you to basically diet and go and really, exercise and become healthy. Dose and just revenue expenditure are like steroids. They give you a little bit of a boost, but what comes back at the end of it is a far worse problem. In contrast, capital expenditure, investment-driven growth is like exercising and actually going and dieting that provides you long-term health. And I think what is really important is that, the investment is focused on, because, through investment, and I think if you look at India as well, even before, before the global financial crisis, the period where India has grown in a sustained way, India has grown on the basis of large investment. So I think it is important for the policymakers to actually attract investment, provide the necessary, environment to really attract investment. And I think that is what I would say. Finally, I would actually, mention that India needs to return to its roots. This is something that we had highlighted in the 2020 economic survey. Wealth creation and ethical wealth creation has been what India actually, what brought prosperity to the Indian subcontinent. Up until 1750 AD, India accounted for more than 1/3 of world's GDP for 17.5 centuries, and that happened from enabling the private sector, enabling entrepreneurship. And I think there is evidence, even if you look at in the recent, last 100 years, if you look at every country, the United States after the World Wars, under the New Deal, Marshall Plan in Europe, the East Asian economies, China today. If you look at each one of these countries, and we showed this very clearly in the 2018-19 economic survey, which laid down the blueprint for India to become a $5 trillion economy. I think it is really important that Goa and all states focus on economic growth through investment, because that is the one that really generates sustained growth through job creation, and it generates inclusive growth through job creation.
Thank you, Dr. Subramanyam. And before we close, we would like to know what are your 5 personal mantras. We have a lot of young people who are participating in this webinar. So, and you are the youngest CA, and we would like to know your 5 personal mantras so they can, follow some of them or all of them.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. So I think the first mantra is something that I already mentioned, what my father gave me, which is, if your only ambition in life is to be rich, it shows an extreme poverty of ambition. The second mantra, which I actually have followed, is serving the nation without greed or without clamoring for glory. I think that is something which is important. Do your dharma and do your karma, in line with your dharma. So I think that is the. Let me tell you that there will be a lot of people who will tell you, Kali Yug mein aisa sab nahi hota hai. All these virtues, old-fashioned virtues of honesty, sincerity, etc. These are all old-fashioned stuff. There'll be any number of critics, Cassandras, who would actually will tell you things that if the shortcut basically give you that is the way to succeed. I will share based on my own life and those that I've been inspired by. I would say that I think being straightforward, working hard, these are very important. So I think keep it simple and look to serve the nation without your selfish interest, being or your self-centered glorification being the most important. So that's the second mantra that I would give. The third I would say is that and having looked at a lot of people, one of life's privileges for me has been to observe the best in the world, be it Nobel laureates, be it top policy makers across the world, or industry captains, and of late, some the top people in government as well. And I think based on that, what I would share is what Thomas Alva Edison said it very nicely, which is genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. So I think that's the third mantra that I would give you. The fourth that I would tell you is, in life, all of us juggle with a lot of different tasks. You are a professional in your office. When you go back home, you're maybe a brother, you're a father, you're a son, husband, wife. You play many different roles. So think about the metaphor of a juggler that is juggling with a lot of balls. And the reason the juggler does not drop the ball is because he keeps an eye on each of the balls, tracks them down, and that is why he doesn't let the balls drop. But sometimes even if the ball drops, he can actually pick those balls up if these are rubber balls. So here's where I want to, career, money, many other things are like rubber balls. But I think there are 2 glass balls in life which you actually should not take your eyes off, because if you take your eyes off glass balls, they fall down to the ground and shatter into pieces, and you'll be collecting those pieces the rest of the life. These are your family and your health. So I think that's the fourth mantra that I would give you. That remember that health and your family, are glass balls that you should never ever take your attention on, away from. Final mantra, something that I've actually, used is that I've thought about always my life actually in the form of a balance sheet, and when I would be in my deathbed, I would be, asking the question, did I create enough assets or did I create liabilities? In this, the 75, 80, 85 years that I actually inhabited this planet, in that period, did I create assets or did I create liabilities? So that's a question that I would ask myself. And I think if I were at the end of my sojourn here on earth, and do remember, by the way, that, all of us are temporary visitors to this planet. Never forget that. In fact, one of the things that, fascinates me about humankind is that, most humans live life as if they're never going to die, and die as if they never lived. So, when you keep that in mind, so have the balance sheet of life, assets and liabilities. And I think, if you have created more assets than liabilities overall, and not just, I'm not talking on monetary terms, but, if you've done a good deed, that's an asset. If you've done a bad deed, it's a liability. So if you have created more assets than liabilities, then I think it's a life worth lived. And I think that perspective, it benefits me at least. Thank you very much.
Well, Dr. Subramanyam, that was fascinating, I must say, and we are indeed indebted to you. Thank you once again for sparing your time, for your grace, and the gift of your time to us. It has been absolutely fascinating, very educative, and very, very informative. And you have been very frank and very open, and we are most grateful to you. We would love to invite you to Goa to spend some time at our International Center, maybe next year when things are improving all over the country. Once again, on behalf of ICG, our president, and everybody else, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Subramaniam.
Thank you.